All right, let's get right into it. We're going to unpack one of the most complex and persistent conflicts in the world today, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to really get a handle on the headlines you see now, you have to go way back. We're talking about a 19th century dream that would completely change the map of the Middle East.
So this is the big question we're trying to answer today, right? How on earth did a desperate search for a safe place to call home end up sparking a conflict that's now been raging for over 100 years? The answer, you'll see, isn't found in today's news. It's buried deep in the past.
And our story actually begins somewhere you might not expect, not in the Middle East, but in 19th century Europe. Because you can't understand the intense drive for a Jewish state without first understanding the very real existential threat that Jewish people were facing there.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is really a tale of two Europes. In Eastern Europe, life for Jews was brutal. You had these organized massacres called pogroms. They were constantly scapegoated. But here's the kicker. Even in so-called enlightened Western Europe, it wasn't safe. The Dreyfus affair in France was a huge wake-up call. Here you have a high-ranking Jewish army officer framed for treason, and it set a shockwave through the community, proving that even if you assimilated, you were never truly safe. The anti-Semitism was just everywhere.
So you got to ask yourself, right? If you're not safe anywhere, what do? Well, out of that desperate reality, Zionism was born. And this wasn't just some ancient religious dream. It was a modern political movement, picking up on the nationalist ideas that were sweeping across Europe. The core idea was simple but radical. The only way for the Jewish people to be truly secure was to have their own nation. And this idea, it wasn't just talk. It sparked action, almost immediately. In what's called the First Aliyah, thousands of Jews started fleeing the horrific violence in Russia. They made their way to Palestine, which at the time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And these weren't soldiers, they were refugees, buying up land and starting to build the very first farming communities.
But these early efforts were kind of like sparks without a real fire. They were scattered, they lacked a central driving force. And that all changed when one man entered the scene, Theodor Herzl. This is the guy who would take Zionism from a scattered dream and forge it into a powerful global political movement. And Herzl is a fascinating character. He wasn't your likely revolutionary. He was a secular, assimilated journalist from Vienna. But he was assigned to cover the Dreyfus affair, and he stood there and watched mobs in Paris, the heart of liberal Europe, screaming death to the Jews. In that moment, he had this absolutely chilling realization. If this can happen here, then no Jew is safe. Anywhere.
So that moment completely radicalizes him. And Herzl wasn't just a writer, he was an organizer. He publishes his manifesto, The Jewish State, and it basically goes viral for its time. Then he pulls off the first Zionist Congress, bringing Jewish leaders together from all over the world. And this was the crucial step. He creates the World Zionist Organization, a real institution with a real goal, to lobby world powers and turn this dream into a political reality.
Now get this. Right after that first Congress, Herzl goes home and writes this in his diary. I mean, it sounds almost delusional, right? The sheer confidence is just stunning. He was absolutely convinced he laid the cornerstone of a new state, and even though it must have sounded insane at the time, he put a date on it, 50 years.
And here's the kicker. He was off by 1 year. 51 years later, the State of Israel was declared. It is a truly mind-boggling piece of historical foresight. Talk about calling your shot. Okay. So the political movement is now organized and has a clear goal. The focus shifts to the ground, to Palestine itself. But here's the problem that would come to define everything. The land wasn't empty, and the Zionist project was now on a direct collision course with the Arab population that was already living there.
And this chart right here, it tells the story better than words ever could. Just look at that demographic shift. In only 2 decades, the Jewish population goes from about 10% to a third of the total. Now imagine you're part of the Arab majority that's been there for generations. This would be deeply, deeply alarming. You're watching your entire society change rapidly without your say.
And if you want to add a geopolitical bomb to this already tense situation, just look at Great Britain. During World War I, as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, Britain was making promises to everybody. They promised the Arabs independence if they helped fight the Ottomans. They promised the Zionist movement a national home in Palestine with the Balfour Declaration. And they were secretly promising the French they'd carve up the region together. They literally promised the same piece of land to 3 different groups.
So what happens when you make all these conflicting promises? Well, exactly what you'd expect. The situation on the ground under British rule just explodes. There were riots in the 20s, then the horrific massacre of the ancient Jewish community in Hebron in 1929. And it all culminated in the Great Arab Revolt in the late 30s, a massive years-long uprising demanding one thing: stop the Jewish immigration.
All right, so this brings us to the tipping point, the final, chaotic years just before Israel's creation. World War II had just ended, the world map was being redrawn, and Palestine was right at the center of the storm.
And you simply cannot understand what happens next without grappling with the Holocaust. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews didn't just create sympathy, it created an undeniable moral urgency for the Zionist cause. The world had just witnessed hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees trapped in Europe, with no country willing to take them. The idea of a Jewish state went from a political goal to an absolute existential necessity. So Britain, unable to control the violence, basically washes its hands of the whole mess and tosses it to the new United Nations. The UN comes up with what it thinks is a logical solution: partition. Divide the land into 2 states. For the Jewish leadership, it was a painful compromise, but it was a state, so they said yes. But for the Arab leadership, it was an absolute non-starter. I mean, they were 2/3 of the population, and this plan from a bunch of foreign powers was going to give away more than half their country. Hell no.
And so, that's the moment. On May 14, 1948, as the last British soldiers are sailing away, David Ben-Gurion stands up and declares the establishment of the State of Israel. It was a moment of incredible triumph and joy. But that celebration lasted less than 24 hours. The very next day, the armies of 5 neighboring Arab nations invaded, aiming to destroy the new state before it could even stand.
Now, that war had a devastating, generation-defining human cost. During the fighting, about 700,000 Palestinian Arabs either fled the violence or were forcibly expelled from their homes. For Palestinians, this is the Nakba, the catastrophe. It's the moment their society was shattered, and it's the birth of the Palestinian refugee crisis, which remains one of the most painful, unresolved issues of the entire conflict.
So you might think, okay, the war's over, now there's peace. Not even close. The 1948 war didn't end the conflict. In a way, it just set the stage for a brutal new cycle of war, followed by failed negotiations, followed by more violence that has defined the region ever since.
And what followed was just decades of state-on-state warfare. The 1967 Six-Day War was a massive turning point. Israel wins this shocking victory and ends up with military control over the West Bank and Gaza, putting millions of Palestinians under its rule. Then, just a few years later, the 1973 Yom Kippur War was this stunning surprise attack that shattered Israel's sense of invincibility, even though they managed to recover and win.
But here's the wild part. In between all this fighting, you have these incredible glimmers of hope, real breakthroughs. The Camp David Accords led to a lasting peace with Egypt, the Oslo Accords in the 90s, that famous handshake on the White House lawn. It really felt like history was turning a corner. But it seems like every single time there's a step forward, it's followed by a collapse, creating this just painful cycle of hope and despair.
Which pretty much brings us up to today. The conflict has changed again. It's not so much about big state armies fighting anymore. It's devolved into a grinding reality of Palestinian uprisings, the rise of militant groups like Hamas, a devastating cycle of wars in Gaza, and a peace process that is, for all intents and purposes, completely frozen.
And so, after all that, we're back where we started. A 19th century dream for a safe homeland has collided with the reality of another people, creating this tangled, painful 21st century conflict. And after more than a century of struggle, it leaves us with the biggest question of all. Is a shared future even possible here? Or is this tragic cycle we've just traced truly unbreakable?